I've come a long way from Europe, and I've decided to start my talk with an idealistic bet. I've decided to bet that if all of you are sitting in this room today, it's because you want to be part of something bigger than yourselves, and that you want to be on the good side of history. I think that this is something that unites us today, because we know that we're facing an existential crisis which is bigger than any of us. This feeling of wanting to do good is a feeling that I recognize because I started my career in peace building and political mediation with it. When I started my career, I was grappling with questions such as, is human nature good or bad? What does peace mean? Is it a horizon that we can reach and maintain? Or is it, as my father would put it, an interlude between two wars? To a certain extent, I think that my most fundamental question was, what characterizes us as humans? What is it that we're made of? What is it that makes us different from other life forms and that we breathe into our civilization? I think that this question is actually at the heart of the multiple crises that we're facing today. And this is why I'd like to share some of my experiences working in conflict and fragile zones, even though it may sound quite distant from the topic of the day. Interestingly, I have found that humans are neither good nor bad by nature, but by structure and by conditioning. I have found that humans are capable of creating forces of tremendous impact into history, and that very often we're unable to recognize when the very forces that we create control us back in return. I have also found that violence is a matter of decisions at times, and a matter of power relations and geographies at others. And I have found that there is one thing for sure that characterizes us as humans. It is not our intelligence, nor our ability to communicate, as I have been taught as a child. It is the fact that we're both a natural and a technological species. Our rapport to nature and to technology defines how we relate to ourselves, to each other, and to the outer world. And what defines our impact on the outer world, either with nature or with technology, is energy. Why does this matter? Well, obviously because we're in an existential crisis. And in the face of this crisis, our predominant response is to shift energy systems rather than question what energy is used for. It worries me because when I look back into the history of humanity and political geographies, changes in energy systems have always affected the metabolism of international relations. As I've learned, the dominant source of energy defines the dominant source of power. Pun intended. Early civilizations were often defined by slave power and abusive human labor. Think of Egypt and the way in which they built the pyramids. Then marine energy led us into the age of colonialism. Think of the Portuguese, Spanish, and British fleet, which conquered so-called new worlds, like here. Coal then created a new age of imperialism in which Great Britain was a first mover. This age of imperialism culminated in 2 world wars, and oil powered the age of Western expansionism and of Pax Americana, which was sustained by military means and which culminated in the war in Iraq. In spite of their differences, all of these different epochs repeated the same patterns of expansionism and very often of violence. They accelerated the domination of men and technology over the realm of nature, what we now define as the Anthropocene. And yet, in spite of thousands of years of historical lessons, what I often hear these days is that the shift to decarbonization is going to solve the climate crisis, and that it's going to culminate into peace. So I wonder, Are we different? Did we learn our lessons compared to our ancestors? And are we asking ourselves the right questions? Like, what are we actually going to use energy for this time? And this other question that keeps haunting me. Will we manage to make peace? Will we make peace at the international level? And will we make peace between ourselves and the planet? If we succeed, we may find that we develop sustainable, peaceful relationships amongst ourselves and with nature and with humanity. If we fail, I fear that my dad may be right, and I honestly do hate when he is. I fear that we may see the unraveling of human civilizations. No pressure. So, I'd like to explain the logic and the claims behind what I'm currently talking about, and which probably lead you to think that I'm a bit too philosophical for my own sake, and certainly for yours, and certainly at this hour of the day. I'll start with the physics part of the story, because everything starts there. Fossils outperform renewables in terms of power density. What this means is that the power density contained in 1 unit of coal, gas, and oil is greater than that produced within 1 solar panel or 1 windmill. This is why fossils brought us the age of the Great Acceleration, which led us into the age of digitalization and into new imaginaries of tech frontier. And yet, fossils also brought us to the cusp of planetary boundaries and may well be the energy that unravels all imaginaries. Because as we've learned before, fossils have led to levels of atmospheric CO2 which have not been seen in the past 4 million years of history on this planet, at a time when no human civilization would have been able to sustain itself. So the age of fossils needs to come to an end. That we know. That's why we're here. But shifting from the age of fossils into the age of renewable does not come without challenges. At the root of these challenges lies the power density problem. This is what this graph shows. To produce the same density of power with renewables, we need more space to install infrastructure to collect solar energy. And critically, we need more materials to build the infrastructures in the forms of solar panels, windmills, EVs, and other clean tech. Critically, we need more minerals. Minerals like these: lithium, cobalt, graphite, rare earths, and others. Minerals that have very low concentration levels into the crust of the Earth. To get 10 grams of copper, for example, we need to move and extract, on average, 1 ton of soil. In practice, that means that we need mines as big as these to produce that much amount of reusable material. What we call green growth, in other words, translates into a new industrial era of planetary proportions, in which countries that have to sustain a strong energy base, like Canada, the US, Europe, China, compete with each other. And they also compete with countries that are trying to establish their base into the new energy chapter of history. And all of those countries are competing with each other to ensure their energy future, and they look for minerals within countries that are particularly well endowed with them. And let me tell you this. As we're here today in this room talking about the technical and technological solutions to the climate crisis, the future of the planet and the future of peace play out largely in countries that supply the very minerals that we need for energy systems here, not over there. And the relationship between countries with higher demand for energy and countries that supply the means for energy will define the future of international and planetary security. It will define whether or not we have a safe planet to live on and secure societies to live in. Let me explain why. Demand for minerals is currently exploding. We've learned that from Simon before. If you take lithium as a proxy, a key component for batteries, global demand between 2010 and 2020 already increased by just short of 300%. It's actually exceeding previous demand models. So this is good news on the climate account, because it means that decarbonization has started. From an ecological perspective, however, we need to be a lot more relative. Because our clean future is going to be more materially intensive than before. The International Energy Agency tells us, for example, that with the current level of innovation, an electric car requires 6 times more mineral inputs than a conventional car. And this is only the start. The World Bank tells us that the production of minerals such as graphite and cobalt could increase by 500% by 2050 to meet the growing demand for minerals only for clean technologies. Do we have enough production capacity to meet this demand? Not quite. That's why Benchmark Minerals and Simon, just before, were telling us that we need to open at least 336 new mines by 2035. Where will those new mines be created? In countries that I happen to know fairly well. Back in 2018, the International Institute for Sustainable Development produced this map. If you look at the green dots on the map, they represent the many different minerals that we need, their geographical location, and their deposit size. As it so happens, a lot of these minerals are located in countries that rank fairly high on corruption indices. These are the shades of brown and red that you see on the map. And they also happen to be located in countries that are fragile, like Sri Lanka, or conflict-affected, like Myanmar or the Central African Republic. Corruption tends to correlate with what we call elite predation, an ability of private and public sector actors to use markets and public institutions for their own wealth accumulation. And sometimes, the instrumentalization of violence and poverty is part of a business model that many elites use and instrumentalize, especially when it favors lucrative sectors like mining. Corruption and predation pose another problem. They tend to correlate quite strongly with societal inequalities and marginalization, 2 factors that the IPCC identifies as being particularly aggravating for climate impacts. So it really doesn't help that the same countries that are well endowed with mineral resources are also the countries that are most climate vulnerable. And it really, really doesn't help that these countries happen to host the most critical ecosystems that we need to regulate the global climate regime, the hydrological cycle, and to protect biodiversity. Changing or eliminating these ecosystems will undermine planetary security, not just international security, planetary security, because we will profoundly disturb biophysical flows. We will release more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And the knock-on effects will include more water scarcity, food shocks, financial shocks, energy shocks, not just in the countries concerned, geographically speaking, but everywhere. One of our big blind spots here, therefore, is that the energy transition that we're going into, in it, we're ignoring structural power relations between the countries that consume tremendous amounts of energy and those that provide it. We're providing linear solutions to a CO2 problem through decarbonization that may threaten ecological integrity on a planetary level and create further inequality and conflict. This is a perfect storm that we need to avoid at all costs. But I have also seen that this is a perfect storm that is already on the march, because there is a new scramble of resources on the way. And it is inherent to the race to decarbonize and to digitalize. It is a race in which China, Europe, the US, Russia, Canada, and other big players are competing. And it is a race which, for the moment, China is well ahead of. You see, we tend to point fingers at China for not going fast enough on its own domestic energy transition. But the truth is that China has been one of the first movers in decarbonization. It is already deploying more renewable energy on its own territory than the US or than Europe. And 20 years ago, China started integrating supply chains for rare earths, from extraction to processing to export. Rare earths are a critical component of our energy transition. Not just that, China controls the midpoint, or the so-called choke point, of supply chains. It has centralized processing of materials, which it exports to countries that want to develop clean tech. That's why Europe is 98% dependent on China for the provision of rare earths, and that's why the entire world is dependent on China at about 60% for the provision of lithium, to name but one material. This is a critical vulnerability for all industrialists and tech developers who will carry the next economic wave. The US knows this. This is why we have now the Inflation Reduction Act. The EU knows this. This is why we're currently developing a critical raw material act. And this is why China is working to acquire as many mines as possible across the world in the countries mentioned before, but also in countries that want to be the future of the tech economy. Over time, this will grant China and its partners, including countries like Russia, the means to redesign the global balance of power. This is partly a good thing, because this is long overdue. But what will the redesigning process lead to if China is able to weaponize supply chains? What will it mean for the companies sitting in this very room? What will it mean if it aims to paralyze economies that support the multilateral order and champion the rule of law and human rights? Energy is not just energy. Energy is a source of power. And the quality of power depends on what energy is used for and what power is willing to compromise upon to sustain itself. This applies to China, and this applies to every big geopolitical player on the block. So we have a series of technological and technical challenges ahead of us, but not just that. We have ecological and existential challenges. We have historical and justice-related challenges, and we have geopolitical ones. So they require different strategies and avenues for actions. The first one of which needs to start with science. Science can tell us where we can mine from an ecological perspective and where it is categorically impossible and undesirable to mine. Anywhere where it's not safe to mine, we should act as though minerals didn't exist and make sure that we establish protected areas where no licensing can take place. This guidance should be elevated to UN circles so that it can lead to multilateral negotiations and ideally enforceable treaties. Then we need national and international strategies. Countries that are late to the decarbonization era, such as Canada, should establish strategies to acquire the autonomous means of their climate ambitions. At home, this requires strong consultation between public and private actors to de-risk investments, particularly in the mining sector, and realign private business models with a political urgency rather than just market strategies. And it also requires investing into security and diplomatic means that aim to deliver geoeconomic outcomes, development outcomes with ecological approaches. This work starts in the countries at the heart of the scramble for resources. Investing into conflict resolution, the fight against corruption and resilience should be top priorities of our energy transition. And adaptation needs to be the new name of the game. And since doing that is a tall order, it only makes sense for countries that align on values such as human rights, freedom, and democratic accountability to rally together and to pool resources. This is necessary to deliver on climate targets, but also to work towards reestablishing a balance of power between various pools of the world that will establish a level playing field in which to discuss economic modeling within planetary boundaries, because this is the ultimate stake of all. It's not just fossils that have to go. It's this notion of economic expansionism. And this work starts here, in this very room, because what needs to change is the global business model. We can't just swap one energy system for the other. That much is clear. We need to reduce our need for energy and minerals, starting with massive public and private investments into circular economic models that prioritize recyclability and substitution of materials. But here's the thing. We know that this is a necessary step, but not a sufficient one. So we also need to develop ecological assessments for supply chains that account for greenhouse gas emissions, but also energy, water, soil, biodiversity, and material footprint. Only on this all-encompassing basis will we be able to understand how globalization needs to change. And finally, we need to change our mindset about innovation. All of this can only happen if we shift our thinking about innovation. Innovation for our times is about reining back economic models within planetary boundaries. Anything else, even the coolest product, even if it sends us on Mars, is not innovation, it is business as usual. One last thing that I've learned in my meanderings in conflict and fragile zones. Ecological security is the foundation for all types of security. We cannot make up for it. This is why I have made it my mission to work on understanding and identifying what ecological security and ecological diplomacy can look like when we start working in all these different baskets of action, all of which require efforts from people like you. This is why I'm looking forward to talking with you in the coffee break or in the hour with me within 1 hour. Thank you so much for your attention.